There are some interesting observations being made following the grand farewell to Queen Elizabeth. What should be said is that the framers of the funeral, who included the late Queen and the new King, respected tradition, but as Charles Moore wrote, quote, were not hidebound by precedent. They chose Westminster Abbey for a monarch's funeral for the first time in nearly 300 years. They knew it could not have been an almost private affair in Windsor because they knew that the Queen, through longevity, television and the internet, and the beauty of her character, had come to belong not only to the country that loved her best, but to the world. Charles Moore is now Baron Moore and a member of the House of Lords. He wrote the authorised biography of Margaret Thatcher, published in 3 volumes, a tremendous read. But he wrote that the framers of the funeral, quote, will not have been unaware that they were organising what must surely have been the most watched Christian service in the whole of human history, unquote. The President of the United States was an honoured guest, of course, amongst the gathering of world leaders. Technically, the most powerful man on the planet, but not so when it comes to British royal decorum. The US President and his wife were relegated to Westminster Abbey's rear seats. Protocol dictates that Commonwealth political leaders outrank those from the rest of the world, regardless of their importance. So President Biden found himself 14 rows from the front and 9 rows behind Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, the neighbour that the US normally looks down upon. I mentioned to you earlier in the week the predicament re Spain. The disgraced former King Juan Carlos, a distant cousin of Queen Elizabeth, has been living in exile, facing all sorts of allegations and charges at home. His son is now the King Philippe. Spain, the nation, was not impressed by the invitation to King Philippe's father, Juan Carlos, and I told you it was being said the King would make every endeavour not to have to speak to his father. But it turns out in Westminster Abbey, they were allocated seats next to one another. In contrast to President Biden's seat at the back of the Abbey, all 7 surviving British Prime Ministers attended the funeral with their spouses and were seated prominently. The seating arrangements were overseen by Earl Marshall, the Duke of Norfolk, who was in charge of the states of the funerals. Occasionally will have very difficult issues about protocol. The Bidens arrived later than planned, couldn't tell the time. World leaders were supposed to be seated by 9:55 a.m. for a service starting at 11. You can imagine the conversation in the intervening hour. President Biden was given permission to travel to the Abbey in the Beast, which is the heavily armour-plated limousine flown over, especially for the occasion. French President Macron was given permission to arrive in his own car. Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau wasn't. They had to bus it, which means that long after the Queen's coffin had departed on its journey from Westminster Abbey to Windsor, a gaggle of minor European royalty and others were seen waiting patiently for a bus to pick them up. Britain's former Prime Ministers left in official cars. But the queue for buses included the King of Spain, the King of the Netherlands, the Crown Prince of Romania, the Queen of Denmark, Jacinda Ardern, Mr Trudeau and his wife. They arrived by bus and they left by bus. After about 20 minutes, brown buses from Westway coaches swept into the area outside the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey and collected them, by which stage the most watched Christian service in the whole of human history was itself part of royal history. And in that service, after all the words had been spoken and all the hymns and anthems sung, the Queen's piper played Sleep, Dearie, Sleep. As Charles Moore wrote splendidly of the piper's music, and I quote, as the sound wrapped itself around the soaring Gothic architecture, young Prince George cast his eyes about, trying to trace where it was coming from. Then it grew quieter and more distant, as if departing over the hills above Balmoral, and everything was at peace.